So I tried a completely new plotting method for this book, and I had mixed opinions as to whether it worked, so we're going to talk about that. Also, this is just one long talk, so maybe have a snack. Here, I got you some Kinder Bueno, some dark chocolate covered hazelnuts. I'm having a root beer, well, like a healthy mushroom elixir root beer. And I got you the cola. Sorry if you're not a hippie. Also, I'm still waiting to hear from the winner of my 5,000 subscriber giveaway, Victoria Mallon. If you're watching, Victoria, leave a comment. I will hook you up with your prize. If I haven't heard by this weekend, I guess I'll draw somebody else. And hello, I'm Lydia Foxglove, and welcome back to my channel. If you've been following this channel, you know that I've mostly been a full-time writer for 16 years, but most of that time I haven't been writing the things that I am truly passionate about. I'm attempting a pivot to the fantasy world that I've been writing about and obsessed with for 30 years. The characters and cultures of this world are what really excites me, but they haven't always been the easiest thing to sell. So my upcoming book, the book that I just finished, The Broken Queen, this is an attempt to straddle the difference. I wanted to tell the story that I wanted to tell and needed to tell, while also trying to lean into some of the popular romantasy tropes in the hopes that sales would be decent enough that I could continue. And in this video, I'm going to take you through the whole process, the idea, the outline, the drafting, the editing. The first thing I should note is that I've had this idea in my head for a long time. The general idea. I knew that there was a very pivotal event that happens in the Dragon Kingdom, which is a small, isolated kingdom to the east, where the people have kind of a symbiotic relationship with dragons. They bond with them and ride them and can talk to them telepathically and all that good stuff. This is one of those stories, in a broad sense, this is one of those stories where the old magic is starting to give way to great accelerated change. I've always loved stories like this, and in fact, The Hidden Lands in a lot of ways is my reckoning with the modern world and how rapidly our own world has changed and is changing. And this fantasy world is going down a similar path. Things have changed a lot in the last 100 years, but they're going to change even more in the next 100 years. And in a lot of ways, that's what the story is about, is the next 100 years. Not this particular story, but all the stories that I want to tell. Anyway, some parts of the world are changing very rapidly and other parts are changing more slowly and reluctantly, but the Dragon Kingdom is one of the few places where like old, ancient magic still resides. As I was writing it, I kept seeing it as this old school JRPG. Everything's this cute little pixel world with little dragons flying around and the little mountains and the little castle. And like it's about to turn into a PS1 game and nobody knows what's about to hit them. So I had this broad idea of big events that need to happen in the scope of history, but I didn't have much handle at all on the minutiae of the characters, their daily lives, their little interactions. This kingdom has been very isolated, and everything else that I've written has taken place in other parts of the world and also later in the timeline. And I never needed to go deeply into the Dragon Kingdom, or actually I knew that I did need to do it at some point, and I've just been putting it off. One thing that I did know about the Dragon Kingdom is that their queen, not a dragon, but a person who is called the Dragon Queen, has been reincarnated over and over and over. So I knew my starting point for the story was, where is the Dragon Queen? What is her reincarnation? It would be cool if there was kind of a twist to that. So I decided it would be interesting if the Dragon Queen, Atora, starts off in the same place almost as Velsa in my Cursed Soul trilogy. She has been born as one of the Finarlum, who are a race of created beings made from magic. Sometimes I refer to them as doll people because that's kind of what they are, is like living dolls with souls. And she's raised to be a concubine and sold off as property. And I also knew then that the king would need to find her. And to do so, he would have to go into enemy territory and kind of rescue her from this situation. But it would definitely be an unfavorable situation for him because, for one thing, she can't have any children. She's an artificial being, and she's been raised in a culture that is very different, whereas all the other queens have at least been the same race, even if they came from different parts of the world. They had some shared cultural heritage. And he's also not very used to being around Finarlem at all. He's probably only seen a handful of them in his entire life, and now he's expected to marry this girl who just seems completely foreign to him in every way possible. And he, like all of his people, finds this system of slavery with the doll people completely abhorrent and morally repellent. But ironically, it is his job to take her back to his kingdom and make her his queen, whether she wants to or not. As far as he knows, no previous incarnation of the queen has ever refused this, because it would be a great honor and her entire family would come with her to the Dragon Kingdom, and it would generally be seen as a good thing, even though, you know, maybe a little difficult for some of the queens, but not like this. And she is happy to be rescued from the situation she is in, but being the queen of a Miralem kingdom is such an overwhelming and foreign thing to her as well. So you have a lot of immediate conflict. Once I established how these two were going to meet and what situation they were going to be in, you know, that's pretty interesting. But sometimes you have a story where you have like a really cool beginning in the setup, and you write the beginning really fast, and then maybe you have an endpoint that's like really far away and you have no idea what's gonna go in the middle. How do you link these things together? And this was definitely one of those stories. So I wrote this nice little beginning, and then I'm like, how the heck am I going to get these two to this far away end point of the story? And this is when I decided to try a plotting method that I have never used before. I took a fantasy romance that had a similar setup that was popular, and I read the whole thing, and I wrote down chapter by chapter what happens in it, all the general beats of emotions and vague events. And then I tried to outline my own novel with the same beats. And saying it like this, it kind of sounds like I might have copied the other novel, but I knew that was absolutely not going to happen, because for one thing, I already had the setup and it was very unique to me. For another thing, I can't even stick to my own outlines, much less the outline that comes from a book someone else wrote. Thirdly, I was trying to copy a general sense of like, oh, here's the chapter where the king has a turning point and starts to warm to her, or here's a point where she's struggling with her new magic. Something vague, not the precise events of what was happening in the book I had just read. I would never suggest to anyone that they write the same book or truly copy someone else's plot or characters, but stripping the house completely down to the studs and remodeling the whole thing, that's another matter. I knew this was going to change and become unrecognizable, and as you'll see as I go, the largest things I picked up from the original book are also very common tropes in fantasy romance anyway. Mainly, I just wanted a book that had a similar reluctant bride trope, and see if I might be able to add a few desirable elements to my book that I might not otherwise have thought of. And this was a total experiment. And the other reason I wanted to do this is because I am notoriously brisk with my pacing, and the type of book this is, I knew that it would just not work if it was a short, briskly paced book. It needed to be the longest book that I had ever written. I just knew that if it wasn't, I would have failed at the book. But when your pacing is naturally brisk and you're trying to learn how to slow down, how do you know you're not being boring? You don't want the book to be long just for the sake of being long. So I had hoped that if I studied a longer book, I might be able to slow myself down with the confidence that I wasn't being boring. Maybe, hopefully. And obviously this is always subjective. I don't think I've ever released a book that I didn't get a review from someone who's like, this book was really slow and boring, and another review that's like, this book was so rushed. People just have different taste and pacing, so this was more about satisfying myself more than anything else. Okay, so I made the outline, and then I started working with it. Really detailed outline, much more detailed than I usually have. And how did that go for me? Well, I have to say in many ways this outline did really help me to get something down. I think if I had not used this method, I might have been stuck for a very long time. Even as it was, this book took me a long time to write. On the other hand, I was still really struggling with the characters feeling like they were alive. And I think part of that is I was writing it based more on this plot thing that needs to happen than the characters themselves, which is the total opposite of how I usually write any Hidden Lands book. Usually I know the characters really well to begin with, and I have to come up with a plot for them to participate in rather than their being a plot that needs to happen and coming up with the characters. So this book was always probably going to be tricky in that regard. And if I compare it to all the other books I've written, I'm probably being a little harsh on it in the character department, because I have had other books that I've written that are more plot driven, and I don't necessarily think they're worse. Sometimes those kinds of books are more exciting to read. It's just that I'm comparing it to books that are extremely character driven, which are usually a little more satisfying to actually write, at least for me. And a couple of interesting things did emerge from outlining the book this way. I ended up adding a few elements that I don't think I would have thought to add on my own. In the original book, there was kind of a rivalrous family member, and this is a pretty common trope. Hopefully the construction vehicles outside aren't too loud. Somebody just brought the property across the street and they're doing a lot of like fill dirt and grading and all that kind of thing. So anyway, a lot of the fairy kingdom books have that rival character. So I ended up giving the king a brother, and it made a lot of sense to me that this brother would be kind of a rival, because in the Dragon Kingdom, the king has so much power. He's the only one that has the power of the dragon blood that is in his line. And their parents died when they were quite young, so naturally they would have kind of rushed to prepare this young man to take the throne, whereas the prince got somewhat forgotten. So he didn't get a lot of attention, he really didn't get any love, and he's kind of an antagonistic character. And I don't usually like those kind of characters, at least in theory, but I ended up finding him kind of fun to write, and I probably wouldn't have added him if not for the other book. So one perk I found of riffing off of another book is that you might play with some tropes that you're not normally drawn to, and sometimes that can actually be kind of fun. I wouldn't want to write like a rival jerky brother all the time, but in this book it made sense, and I think it added something to it. And I also added in a sweet best friend character, another trope that pops up a lot, the sweet best friend to counterbalance the main character. I actually like sweet best friends anyway, but in this case I probably wouldn't have added her in because Atora already had a best friend in the House of Concubines, and I knew that she was going to pop up again. But this made me realize, yeah, she also needs a friend in the Dragon Kingdom as soon as she arrives there. So I added in Tasha, and I can't imagine the book without her now. She ended up being quite crucial. And an unexpected theme emerged as I was writing the two of them. This is one of those things where I'm probably going to get some review that's like, this book was too political. There's always that one person who gets mad if your books appear to have any commentary on anything that is happening in the real world, or if there's too much diversity. Just try writing fantasy books that never end up brushing up against real world politics. Politics and life are intertwined. So in this case, I did not plan to include this theme, but it was about a woman having agency over her own body and her decision to have children, because Atora is expected to have the heirs to the kingdom like every dragon queen before her, but she can't because her body is artificial. There are some people in the kingdom, though, that suspect that perhaps her soul chose to become a Phenarlum to escape her duty. And this is all just kind of religious speculation. They don't know how reincarnation works. They know that it does, but they have no proof that a soul can make any kind of choice. But just like us in the real world, they have to reckon with belief, and some of the kingdom believes that she, in essence, decided to reject her duty and privilege to have the dragon born. And as the king is seeing how she is treated for this, he actually starts to warm to her and take her side. He realizes that he doesn't actually really want children either, particularly not in the way that they are traditionally had, which is that the queen's dragon mount, his soul would go into the king's body in the night of conception so that her child will have dragon blood and dragon power. So he doesn't actually get to really conceive his own child, and in fact he doesn't really have agency over his body either when it comes to having their child, and neither of them want that. Tasha, on the other hand, truly wants to have children, and she would be be honored to have the Dragonborn, even though she knows it's always a difficult pregnancy. She really wishes that this was her role. That fits the kind of character she is. She's very maternal and she loves children. So I ended up really enjoying that little theme that emerged, as well as how these two women that want different things end up supporting each other in their desires. So those two characters resulted from this outlining method. I think they both added a lot to the story, and it also really did help me to slow down my pacing. This did end up being the longest book I've ever written by quite a good bit. It's 130,000 words, and I think my longest one prior to that was like 100,000. So if you're having trouble with pacing, whether it's too fast or too slow, I would recommend doing this at least once. I have a feeling I'm going to be better at pacing a longer book going forward, just from this one exercise. And of course, me being me, the deeper I got into it, the more I drifted away from everything that I had planned, including some of the earlier chapters, including even the original idea for the book to begin with. And this is very common for me. Once I get to like the final third or so, I usually end up going off the rails. I wish I was better at anticipating what the characters were going to do, but no, I'm just not. One of the curveballs came from me putting in the Winged Tribe. Back in the earliest versions of this story, when I was young, the Winged Tribe were very much part of the cultural landscape of this region. But when I wrote Between the Sea and Sky, I ended up kind of stealing my Winged Tribe, at least their physical characteristics, and putting them in Between the Sea and Sky. At that point, I deleted them from my original story because I didn't want to copy myself, and I had not planned to put them back in. But as I was writing, I kind of missed them, and I was like, Between the Sea and Sky came out in 2011, and it's not like it was a blockbuster or anything. Like, no one's gonna care if you reuse your winged people. Besides that, although they're physically very similar, culturally they're totally different. In Between the Sea and Sky, the winged people are very intellectual and they're worldly. In this book, they are a strict matriarchal warrior society that does not like to have contact with outsiders. So once I added them back in, I could reintroduce the character of Sairi, and he's a really old character. I think I first started writing about him when I was like 15, and he was in a different book, and I was always struggling with this book. I loved the characters, but I could just never make the book work. I didn't know how to end it, but I still miss Sairi. He's just a good dude. And he had a romance in that book, and I realized once I put the Winged Tribe back in that like the girl that he liked in his original book is extremely similar to Tasha, and as soon as I thought that, it was like, oh, of course, they are going to be very attracted to each other. And it felt very right to give them a cute little love story on the side, especially since Harai and Atora have a lot of problems with their love story. Theirs is more slow and difficult. So it was nice to have some side characters just have like an adorable romance without as many heavy responsibilities. They can just fall in love at first sight and be cute, and everyone's rooting for them. But my plot line had it that the villain had a motive to court Tasha, and Tasha had some reasons to be interested in the villain. But by the time I'd gotten to all this, Tasha was madly in love with Sairi, so obviously she is not going to give the villain the time of day. So that changed everything that I had planned, and we're getting pretty deep into the book now, so I dare not tell you how I worked that one out. But this is the thing that always vexes me when I get to the final part of a book. I have to rethink everything because something like that always ends up happening. Still, by the time I got to the final third, the characters felt like they were finally really starting to gel and have like real chemistry with each other. I was starting to have fun. I wrote the last third really quickly compared to the previous 2/3. It's so much easier once the characters seem like they're living on their own. And one of the great frustrations of a novel is when I'll think up this character and on paper they sound great. They sound like the kind of character that I always enjoy. And then sometimes you write them and they're great. They work out just like you planned. And other times it's like they're just flat. There's no chemistry with me and the character. And I have no idea why that is. What's even more frustrating is it often seems like there's not a lot I can do about it. Like however they show up feels kind of set in stone. Like I can tweak some things and I can often improve them. But there have been very few cases where a character showed up and I didn't have chemistry with them and I made some changes and they like really clicked for me. Usually however they show up is just like, that's what you get. That's also sometimes why, like, it's so much easier writing follow-up books, because you'll have side characters that just appear that are really fun. And by the time you get to the follow-up book, you can pick which ones you want to write about, and you can choose your favorites, and you already are excited to write about them. Like when I wrote the Witch Among Warlocks series, I had so much fun writing Charlotte's friend Daisy, and I also loved Orson, who is one of the fairies, but like he's not like a beautiful fairy, he's like a hairy peasant fairy. He's kind of crude, and he's kind of like just a big, goofy, faithful dog, and he's kind of hilarious. He's not a character like what I usually plan or am drawn to. He just kind of showed up, and he was so different and so alive on the page that I ended up being really excited to write about Daisy and Orson, and I had a much better time with them than I did with the original cast, even though I did like the original cast, but side characters, they're just easier. So that brings me to the end of the drafting process, which took forever. By the way, like so long. Part of that is that my father-in-law died in the middle of it, and I had that whole eBaying his household debacle for 2 years. But this book was also just difficult. I flailed around with it a lot. I have a feeling that my future series are probably not going to give me this much trouble, at least I hope not. And I think it was always going to be hard. That was partly why I put off writing it for so long. I kept thinking, I'm just not really ready to handle this book. And then years went by, and eventually I asked myself, do you think you're ever going to be more ready to write this book than you are right now? And the answer felt like no, especially if I never try writing books I don't feel ready for. And as is often the case with these things, I probably would be even better at it if I wrote a similar book now, because I've already done it once, but you know, that's how it works. So then I needed to edit the book. Some of you have asked me if I hire an editor. And it looks like that's probably going to be an upcoming topic for my exclusive Patreon video of the month, but I will answer in short here that I have not. I'm not opposed to the idea, but I have had mixed experience with editors, and I don't write the type of book where I'm really confident that they're going to do well. So it's kind of like if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to edit the sound of the tree, would you hire an editor to make it sound better when it falls? It's only after a book does well that then I'm like, maybe I should have hired an editor for it. So anyway, I do all the editing myself for now. I do a lot of editing as I go. It's very common for me to stop like at several points in the draft and go back and like kind of course correct the whole thing and tweak some scenes, maybe add a chapter, delete a chapter. I also line edit the previous chapter that I wrote before I start the next one. Then I'm printed up and I read it aloud as I'm writing it, and I make little notes on the draft. And I read it to Dade, and sometimes he also has some input or some good suggestions. And then when I get to the end, on some books I don't have a lot to change by the time I get to the end if it's kind of a short, simple book. But in this case, it was not a short and simple book. I had quite a few more edits I wanted to go back and do. I talked about some of those in my month in my life writing video. So if I'm doing large scale edits, I'm particularly looking for places where I can strengthen the characters, their motives, their relationships, maybe add in a few little cute scenes if I didn't give them a lot of room to breathe, maybe pepper in a little more foreshadowing of things that I ended up, tossing in there later. There's so many little things that I look for, and I also do very hardcore line editing. I read it aloud again usually, and I go through it on the computer. I'm really studying every sentence. If you've ever tried to break into traditional publishing, you know that you will scrutinize every sentence of your query and your first 50 pages or so, because a lot of agents will ask for either the first 3 chapters or the first 30 to 50 pages with a query. So you're really line editing the heck out of every sentence, especially in those early bits. But you also want the rest of the book to hold up to the beginning, and you get used to thinking about every single word. Does every single word need to be there? Is this description pulling its weight? Is this boring? I'm definitely not here to be a snob about indie publishing whatsoever, but I can tell when I'm reading indie published books that whether or not a writer has probably ever tried to write for traditional publishing, or maybe is just writing under a pen name and they were a traditionally published author, because there's usually kind of a quality to into the line editing. And frankly, as long as people are reading and loving your book, like who am I to judge how much line editing you put into a book? For me, I just can't help it. I do a lot of line editing. And then I still get reviews that were like, the writing was so amateurish and there were so many typos, which always kind of makes me wonder if they've ever read an indie book before. But it is true. I think all my books have typos. Even my traditionally published books have typos, and my indie published books probably have twice as many typos as my traditionally published books. But it is so hard to catch all the typos. Still, it is getting like at least 4 passes, some of them on paper and some of them on the computer screen. And a lot of what I'm looking for when I'm doing a line edit is just like little trims, those little micro tweaks to make a book feel tighter and more polished. Like I'll find that I'm doing a lot of she walked to the door, and as I'm reading it in depth, I'll realize it's obvious that she walked to the door. I don't need to describe every little action. And that's the kind of thing, it's not going to ruin a book if you have an unnecessary action thrown in there, but when you have the cumulative effect of like 20 people unnecessarily walking to a door throughout the whole manuscript, you do start to notice in your subconscious that it gets a little bogged down. So that is the final stage. And once that is done, it's off to my review team. They also usually do typo checks. And then I can take a little break. So I did decide to play Final Fantasy VIII for the first time, and man, I'm having such a good time. Is Man with the Machine Gun like the most rockin' battle theme or what? Like I'm there playing just like... But it's been a week now. I'm gonna get back to work on some writing. I'm sure I'll do more videos on the process because every book has a different process and different challenges that pop up. And I also need to write the second book because The Broken Queen does end on a bit of a cliffhanger, and I'm sure some of you will be very curious about how do you plan out duologies, trilogies, series, and such. I think The Broken Queen or The Court of the Last Dragon. I do think The Court of the Last Dragon will be a duology, not a trilogy, hopefully. That probably needs to be its own topic, the whole writing trilogies and etc. thing, but I have learned a lot about that because I've now written quite a few series. And at first I had very little confidence in that. So that's on my list. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. I try to at least answer all the questions and then include some of them in my weekly Q&A, which you can access for free on both my Patreon and my Substack. And if you join the paid tier of either, you also get access to my Discord server and my bonus videos that people vote on and all that. But I deeply appreciate each and every one of you who is here watching my videos. I read all your comments and I truly appreciate each one of them. And I love having the opportunity to encourage you in any little way that I can with your own creative endeavors. Thank you for inviting me and my little 50s table to ramble on, and I will see you next time. Bye!